afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend my lecture. Thank you very much also to Dr. Tupas for accepting Dr. Salonga's invitation to be the reader reactor in today's lecture. So my paper titled Sifting Through Layers of Inequality, Philippine English and Academic Writing Assessment is actually a continuation of the research I did for my master's thesis. But this time, I am more critical of world Englishes, which was the framework I used in my thesis. So let me start. The question on the acceptability of Philippine English in academic writing is tied to the question of its legitimacy as a variety of English, which in turn is connected to the discussion of ownership of the English language. For quite some time, it seemed like this was no longer an issue. As early as 1969, Teodoro Liamson already claimed that there is a standard variety of English that has emerged in the Philippines, and it is a legitimate variety. According to Liamson, there is a standard Filipino English which is acceptable in educated Filipino circles. He stressed that SFE considers the fact that educated individuals are both the representatives and judges of acceptable speech in a language community. In 1983, Gonzalez asserted that the development of Philippine English is inevitable and that no matter how much the English teacher tries, a local variety will develop because once a society decides to adopt a foreign language as its second language, it owns that language and begins the dynamic process of indigenization in and adaptation to the society and culture. According to Gonzalez, one accepts this development rather than makes value judgment. Villarreal shares Gonzalez's opinion and adds that if it's the same language errors over and over, then these may not be due to intellectual or acquisitional deficiencies, but to the sociocultural context. A bolder declaration was made by Abad in his famous statement, "English is ours, we have colonized it too." In 2000, Bautista declared that the issue on the legitimacy of Philippine English is no longer relevant. Philippine English is a nativized variety of English that incorporates innovations in vocabulary, grammar, and discourse. In 2011, Bolton said that if 21 years of age might still be regarded as the maturity, Philippine English came of age 2 decades ago. For him, Philippine English was already recognized in 1969 when Liamson published his groundbreaking work on standard Filipino English. This notion of a standard Philippine English has developed as part of the world Englishes paradigm, which was conceptualized in the early 1960s as a response to the monocentric view on English as the standard language. The paradigm questions the dichotomy between native and non-native speakers of English and emphasizes that English should take the plural form Englishes to acknowledge that it has spread to other places and now exists in diverse environments with diverse users. Brad Katchrew, the most influential figure associated with world Englishes, asserted that the traditional dichotomy between native and non-native speakers of English is functionally uninsightful and linguistically questionable because there are different contexts in which English is used, especially in multilingual places. In 1985, he conceptualized the concentric circles composed of the inner circle, the outer circle, and expanding circles in order to represent the spread of English with reference to the historical, social, linguistic, and literary context of the language. The circles represent the types of spread, the patterns of acquisition, and the functional allocation of English in diverse cultural contexts, as the language was transferred to other countries in the different diasporic waves of the spread of English. The inner circle represents the traditional basis of English, dominated by mother tongue language. The English spoken in this circle is considered norm providing because certain standards are developed and dictated by the speakers of the variety. The outer circle represents the English that was introduced through colonization in Asia and Africa. English in the outer circle is said to be norm developing. They are already institutionalized and are developing their own standards based on the variety of English that they have. The Philippines belong to this circle. The users of these varieties do not have common attitudes about a locally defined norm. Most of the time, there is confusion between linguistic norms and linguistic performance. But generally, the localized norm has a well-established linguistic and cultural identity. The expanding circle, on the other hand, represents the further diffusion of English to the rest of the world, where English is used as the primary foreign language. The English in this circle is said to be norm-dependent, dependent on the rules set by the inner circle varieties, either American or British English. Katru then emphasized that the world English's paradigm must be adopted to account for the quality of all the varieties of English used in different places. The framework focuses on inclusivity and pluricentricity in approaches to the study of English in its global context. The world English's paradigm has empowered Philippine English to assert its ownership of the language by recognizing it as a legitimate variety of English. Moreover, the publication of Bautista's book defining standard Philippine English, its status and grammatical features, and the compilation of the International Purpose of English Philippines, or the ISPH, have seemingly concluded the discussion on Philippine English. Most Filipino scholars that came after Bautista have celebrated the idea that indeed Philippine English is a nativized variety of English, and that this variety has innovations in vocabulary, grammar, and discourse, because the variety of English introduced by the Americans, the Thomasites, has to be accommodated and appropriated to fit its new culture and new environment. I agree that compiling the corpora and codifying the features of Philippine English are breakthroughs in Philippine English studies. However, they are not enough to account for the complexities that the so-called owning and colonizing English entails. Studies in Philippine English have mostly focused on the structure of language, phonology, morphology, and syntax, but they have not examined discourse pragmatics and the social-linguistic aspects of Philippine English. According to Bambos, this is one of the problems in most world English studies. They stop after the identification and codification of the distinct features and take for granted other issues such as the socio-linguistic, political, and pedagogical concerns. There are also questions on the premise of world Englishes, that being grounded in geography and genetics, the model seems to imply that the situation is uniform for all countries within a particular circle, when that is not the case. Jenkins argues that there is a gray area between the inner and outer circle varieties, because in some outer circle countries, English may be the first language learned for many people and may be spoken for the home rather than purely for official purposes such as education, law, and the government. One of the criticisms on world Englishes, the most relevant to the Philippine English context, is Tupas's. He questions the indifferent position of world English scholars on the politics of language and their disregard of certain inequalities resulting from the dominance of English in societies around the world. According to Tupas, these inequalities should be interrogated because while Englishes are all linguistically equal, their political legitimacies are unequal. He also argues that while the ideology that presupposes that all languages and varieties are equally theoretically sound, it does not follow that the political and economic realities are also equal. Tupas introduced the notion of unequal Englishes, a term that highlights various forms of inequalities that are embedded in the ideologies of the different Englishes. The paradigm of unequal Englishes is centered around the politics of Englishes or the pluralization of English. It treats varieties of English as unequally valued and distributed and looks into the structures, contexts, and configurations of inequalities of Englishes, then seeks to find ways to address them. Tupas's notion of unequal Englishes provides a more nuanced interrogation of the complexities of Philippine English and other world Englishes varieties that were not previously addressed as he looked into the ideological foundations of world Englishes, as well as the political contexts that were taken for granted in other studies using the world Englishes paradigm. He refuses to join the celebration because doing so would mean forgetting the massive inequities sustained and perpetuated by the unbridled dominance of English today. Brogdy shares Tupas's view in refusing to romanticize the equality of Englishes. According to her, there is no such thing as neutral playing field where all languages enjoy equal status. Power is real. This power becomes even more real because of the status that English represents, its historical link with British colonialism and imperialism, which is strengthened more recently by its close interlocking with the corporation of the world, as embodied by the process of globalization. Other scholars have also used the Unequal Englishes framework in making sense of linguistic inequalities in their own contexts. Kubota says that the pluralist approaches to English, including World Englishes, tend to overlook inequalities and power hierarchies that exist among Englishes, diverse English speakers, and languages. She argues that a critical approach to examining the inequalities that exist among English users, and languages, including um, English, should be examined. Ramanathan asserts that the splintered, hybrid, and unequal Englishes that exist on a post-colonial Indian ground are entrenched at the base of a class-based divide, and policies and mandates of the state, especially in the field of education, were instances of rule and divide. Park moves away from the macrostructures of globalization, neo-imperialism, transnational capital, rigid social class divisions, and educational reproduction, and argues that inequalities of English are also deeply subjective and could be felt by individuals as anxiety, frustration, and uneasiness. He uses the Unequal Englishes framework to talk about linguistic inequalities as both structural and subjective, political and personal, using the context of Korean learners of English. Lee and Jenks extended the notion of unequal Englishes to include aestheticization of language, which they define as a process in which individuals evaluate a language resource for usage as aesthetically appealing on the basis of its stylistic, grammatical, or phonological appearance. Situating the study in a university in Hong Kong, they argue that language aestheticization is an ideological commitment that sustains a speaker's metapragmatic distance from English. This treatment of language aesthetic, not just functional and communicative, is reflective of a complex interplay of ideology and access to dominant language resources, and thus is useful in understanding the continued inequality across Englishes in various global contexts. This interplay of different conversations, both on World Englishes and Unequal Englishes, shows the discussions on the legitimacy of Philippine English are still relevant, contrary to what Bautista asserted years ago. Philippine English may be a nativized variety, but it is only considered standard insofar as the notion of World Englishes as a theoretical paradigm is concerned. In reality, such as in standardized tests, writing assessments, surveys on English proficiency, it is still seen as an inferior language with features that are not up to par with standard American English or any other variety in the inner circle. Thus, the discussion should be continued and extended to interrogate the celebratory stance of Filipino scholars. In this paper, I will look into the existing inequalities between Philippine English and standard American English in the context of academic writing assessment by examining the language and mechanics aspect of the rubric developed by the DECL GE Committee to assess the proficiency in academic English of English 13 students. Using the rubric as a take-off point, I will identify different layers of inequalities and account for the contexts and assumptions behind these layers. The paradigm of unequal Englishes will be used to make sense of some conflicting conversations that surround Philippine English and to make explicit the gaps between the rubric and the reality of Philippine English and the language reality of the students by extension. Okay. This is done in the hope to contribute to the ongoing discussion on Philippine English and on critical language assessment. So I will talk about the rubric as part of my analysis. In 2017, in the light of curricular changes brought about by the implementation of the K-12 program, the GE Committee of the Department of English and Comparative Literature was tasked to assess the proficiency in academic English of K-12 graduates and to find out whether the changes implemented in the English 13 curriculum are aligned to the student's proficiency level. The data from the diagnostic assessment task will be used to improve instruction, modify curricula, and decide if remedial support like bridge programs will be necessary. To do this, the DECL conducted a diagnostic writing assessment task to English 10 students in the first semester of academic year 2017 to 2018, and again to English 13 students in the first semester of academic year 2018-2019. Then, in order to evaluate the students' writing proficiency more comprehensively, a rubric was developed. The rubric has three main categories: content, organization, and language and mechanics. It is based on the IELTS academic writing task, prompt, and rubric, which is designed to test students' ability to respond to a given essay prompt, organize ideas, and use grammar and diction appropriately. Although patterned after the IELTS, the rubric has been revised considering the UP context. The bands were reduced from 9 to 7, with 1 and 2 as beginner, 3, 4, 5 as intermediate, and 6 and 7 as advanced levels. These bands were determined based on the literature that 7 levels is recommended for raters to be able to discriminate among levels of writing ability. Additionally, they were reduced because of the assumption that UP students have taken their basic education in an ESL context, whereas the lower bands of the IELTS rubrics more likely describe a student with an English as a foreign language background. Second, the descriptors were also appropriated to account for the language proficiency of the Filipino learners. So for example, the section in grammar was elaborated on to account for the common problems that Filipino learners encounter, like problems in preposition, subject-verb agreement, etc. The descriptors also from the Old English 10 guide were integrated in the proposed rubric. A core team was assigned to research on existing literature in assessing students' proficiency level, to create a prompt for the essay, and to develop the initial rubric to be used in marking the essays. A statistician was also consulted to make sure that the sample is representative of the freshman population and that the process is objective and statistically sound. After the diagnostic assessment was administered, essays were grouped through systematic random sampling. Then, to validate the rubric, raters were asked to apply the rubric in assessing the diagnostic essays. It will then be refined according to the raters' feedback. They are considered experts in their fields, and their insight is important in validating and revising the rubric. I will show the rubric later on in my analysis. What does this rubric represent? Sorry. McNamara defines a rubric as a set of instructions given to candidates before a test or a task. It is an instructional tool that is useful in evaluating a student's performance, but it is also a sorting machine that creates categories and divisions. For Muller, however, rubrics are not just simple guides for grading. They are ideological apparatuses that reflect the accumulated practices of a dominant group, which decides what is appropriate versus inappropriate, exceptional versus substandard, passing versus failing. Rubrics could also mirror dominant beliefs and silence less dominant ones. Given the hegemonic potential of a rubric and the earlier discussion on world English and unequal Englishes, it is important to problematize the role that rubrics play in assessment, especially in language testing, in which it may act as the unobservable criteria that influence design of the test. This notion is similar to Bambos's distinction between overt and covert language policies. A rubric may be considered a covert policy that determines which usage of English is standard. The rubric that was developed by the GE Committee could be an example of a covert language policy that represents the stance of the committee on the use of English in academic writing. According to Bambos, most language policies are overt in their pronouncements of rules, laws, and regulations, but there are also those that are covert and can only be inferred from observable practices. Whether overt or covert, they are present and still affect the reality of language education. In this case, even if there are no explicit set standards given by the committee, the stance may be inferred from the rubric. And that is what I'm going to talk about in the next part of the paper. Tupas has already alerted us that certain inequalities have perpetuated different domains in society because of the dominance of English. But instead of qualities, they are brushed aside because according to him, we have been seduced into celebrating our victories over English. Other studies on unequal Englishes have also highlighted different configurations of inequalities and power hierarchies in the society because of the use of English. Inequalities in ideological, social, linguistic, and economic possessions, to name a few. The literature also shows analysis of these inequalities in different contexts, such as in the classroom, in call center industries, and in different intercultural interactions. I agree that these inequalities exist, and I argue that they are also present in academic writing assessment. I view these inequalities in terms of layers that are so inextricably linked that they may not be noticeable on the surface. Although it is possible to demarcate differences among the layers, they are also difficult and they are also overlapping and are difficult to untangle. Nevertheless, it is worth sifting through these layers to concretize instances of inequalities in the language assessment. I will do so by examining the language and mechanics part of the rubric. As mentioned earlier, the rubric has three main categories: content, organization, and language and mechanics. I will only focus on language and mechanics in my analysis because this is the aspect of Philippine English that is identified and codified in almost all studies on Philippine English. The macro aspect of Philippine English is an area that is not yet fully tapped in research studies. And although it is possible to look into content and organization using existing rhetorical theories, there are no distinct features in Philippine English to compare and contrast them with. The first layer is symbolic inequality. This has something to do with the privilege given to a language because of what it represents. In the case of standard American English, the privilege is rooted on the prestige and the hegemonic power of the language, not just as an inner circle variety, but as a universal, international, and global language. In the Philippines, SAE, or Standard American English, is the imagined ideal, and academic institutions are other participants that move around that ideal. This regard for SAE as the ideal standard is common to outer varieties of English because of their shared context of colonization. He has says that there is still a premium given to the native speaker, and other speakers are just participants who want to be native or to have native proficiency in English. This is also similar to Kubota's assertion that in teaching and learning, a traditional approach, that privileged standard varieties of English still prevail. The kind of privileging was evident in the construction of the assessment tool. Both the writing prompt and rating descriptions in the initial rubric were based on the IELTS academic writing test. It was explained in the rationale of the project that IELTS was chosen as the basis because the academic module of IELTS is widely used by many universities internationally to assess the readiness of students to communicate using English. However, standardized tests like the IELTS exemplify inequality in the use of English because the skills of the test takers are judged against a certain standard. While IELTS claims that the test is fair to test takers, whatever their nationality, cultural background, etc., it also stresses that it recognizes all standard varieties of native speaker English, including North American and British English, hence marginalizing other varieties of English from the outer and expanding circles. The fact that the rubric was patterned after IELTS implies that the norm-providing varieties are still perceived as the model that dictates the acceptable level of proficiency in English. This is problematic in the context of law of distal diminishment, which states that any educational tool becomes less instructionally useful and more potentially damaging to educational integrity the farther away from the classroom it originates or travels. Basing the rubric on the IELTS, while efficient because it is standardized, is thus remote to and may be removed from the context of the Filipino student whose diagnostic essay is being assessed using the rubric. The assumption that standard American English and other inner circle varieties are the ideal standard may also result in linguistic inequality. For instance, linguistic inequality is the second layer of inequality that I identified. This is characterized by an even treatment of the linguistic aspects of standard American English and Philippine English. For instance, if we look at the rubric, okay, it's stated there that in order to get a rating of 7, a student should exhibit an excellent command of syntax, write sentences that are grammatically free, and possess a wide range of vocabulary in order to fluently and flexibly convey precise meaning. The assumption behind the language and mechanics criteria is that a student who has advanced proficiency in academic English has all of these characteristics described in the descriptors. This places a Filipino student who is proficient in Philippine English, in what Robbie calls position of deficit competence. Because if we look at the codified features of syntax and morphology of Philippine English, as shown in the table, we can see that the features that make Philippine English distinct are the same features that are described in the rubric as grammatical errors and as lapses or errors in word choice. Lapses or errors in word choices. Following the standard set by the rubric, the highest possible rating that a student using Philippine English could get is a 5. The inequality here lies not so much in the description in the rubric per se, but on the symbolic authority afforded to English as the standard in determining what is excellent, proficient, appropriate, and acceptable in the academic context. In this sense, the World English's paradigm has failed to eliminate the dichotomy between native and non-native English. The standard is still the varieties in the inner circle, and there is still a debilitating monolingual or monocultural bias that places Philippine English in a disadvantaged position when it comes to using and teaching English in the classrooms. This study that I conducted, in which I asked college English teachers to validate the acceptability of lexical innovation of students, I found out that teachers are tolerant of linguistic deviations in the spoken form because of their awareness of the social linguistic context of the students, but they are not as accepting of these deviations in the written form. They still subscribe to the idea that in more formal contexts, the standard should be used, and Philippine English is confined to more casual and creative usage. Their awareness of the tendency of Filipino students as second language learners to use a variety of different languages strategies as shown on the screen is only at the theoretical level and rarely translates into praxis. A study conducted by Martin in 2010 also noted that awareness of the existence of a Philippine variety does not necessarily translate into acceptance of the variety. In a survey of public school teachers in the Visayas, she found out that most of those teachers subscribe to standard American English, even if they themselves speak Philippine English. The teacher cited the following reasons for doing so. This uneven treatment of standard American English and Philippine English is at the root of unequal Englishes and have much to do with the historical, economic, political, and ideological processes associated with colonization and globalization. We can see the disjunction between the hegemony of the standard and the pseudo-post-colonial phase of Philippine English, because while Filipino teachers are aware of the existence of Philippine English and use Philippine English themselves, they are still governed by the ideal and or the imagined standard. Abad may have been right in claiming that we have colonized and owned English, and that Filipinos, just like other colonized nations, have succeeded in appropriating English to fit our cultural realities and have found different creative ways of resisting colonialism, one of which is destroying the English language or essentially altering the manipulating the structure and functions of English in its new ecology. But that is only as far as literature is concerned. Tope paraphrased Abad in a more nuanced statement, saying that Philippine writers have appropriated English as a genuine, guiltless, and creative mode of self-expression, whether it is in the standard form or in the form of variety. But in a more communicative aspects, academic writing included, English users in the Philippines remain beholden to a certain standard. There is still much emphasis on standard language use in most educational systems, and this emphasis is also carried over to language requirements in the workplace. As shown in Martin's study, proficiency and fluency in standard American English is seen as material capital, a gateway to opportunities and social mobility, one's ticket to a high-paying job. This mindset, which leads to the third layer that I identified, material inequality, cannot be detached from the third world reality of the Philippines. Proficiency in English is no longer just symbolic and linguistic, but material as well, given that there are opportunities here and abroad as incentives for improving one's English. Coincidentally, surveys and studies on the supposed decline in English proficiency of the Filipino English peaked in the early 2000s at a time when there was a high demand for call center agents and related BPO operations. This layer of inequality is not explicitly manifested in the rubric, but is definitely connected to language assessment and to institutional language policies. It can be recalled that in 2003, President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo signed Executive Order 210, a mandate to strengthen the policy on the use of the English language as a medium of instruction in the educational system. Although the EO did not specify which variety of English is to be used, it is safe to assume that it refers to an inner circle variety, most probably standard American English, given that the objective of the policy is to develop the aptitude, competence, and proficiency of all students in the use of the English language to make them better prepared for the job opportunities emerging in the new technology-driven sectors of the economy. This can be explained by Ramanathan's claim that languages tend to be viewed as economic commodities, especially because of hastening technological cross-currents across different parts of the planet. That commodification of language becomes even more pronounced when it is state-sponsored. Kubota explains this in terms of neoliberalism with the language competency of the human capital as the most valuable and most exploited commodity at the center. She further states that not only are nations in competition for larger capital, each individual worker is expected to demonstrate a competitive edge. Not everyone, however, has access to that competitive edge. And this increases incidence of material inequality. Despite the promise of social mobility, job employment, and symbolic power, access to privileged values and practices associated with English remains hugely available only to small groups of speakers. While my analysis of the rubric is not exhaustive, being limited to the micro aspects of Philippine English, nonetheless, I was able to draw attention to the following important points. First, the discussion on the issues of Philippine English is far from over. Owning Philippine English is a celebrated yet empty claim, as Tupas has mentioned earlier. While it may be true that Philippine English has been nativized, it is far from being owned and colonized, much more decolonized. Nativization works only on a linguistic level, identification and codification of phonological, morphological, and syntactic aspects. But in order to erase the lingering traces of English imperialism and to claim ownership of the language, learning and teaching enterprise is imperative to move away from nativization to decolonization. Second, studies on Philippine English should utilize the Unequal Englishes framework to surface disjunctions in the theory and practice and to interrogate more layers of inequalities. The focus of the study should also be on the macro aspects of the language. While it is important to identify and codify all those structural features, a discussion of discourse strategies, rhetorical patterns, and pragmatic issues would help language scholars have a deeper grasp of the cultural and ideological intricacies of Philippine English. Third, that the rubric is not just a simple assessment tool, but an ideological tool that acts as a repository of dominant practices and conventions, whether overt or covert. This tool can be used to maintain the status quo and silence less dominant ones. Sorry. We need to pay more attention to our positions and ideological leanings when we create a rubric, or in the GE Committee's context, when we revise the rubric, since it's still in the initial stage of development and has not been actually used to mark students' essays. Fourth, that the layers that resulted from the analysis of the rubric are not limited to rubric and assessment, but are inequalities that have long perpetuated the discussion of English. This may also be considered when framing the goals for developing an assessment tool. In the rationale provided in the rubric project, it was mentioned that the data that will be gathered from the diagnostic essays will be used to improve instructions, modify curricula, and decide remedial support like that. So it may be important to, when we do the assessment again, or when we revise the rubric, it may be important to take or to factor in, okay, the things that I have talked about. And lastly, power relations exist among various Englishes, among various users of Englishes from different backgrounds and social-linguistic realities, and between English and other languages, as produced by the prominence of English as a topic of academic investigation. What may be lacking is critical attention to the inequalities that exist among English users, and languages, including Englishes, and that is what I am trying to achieve in my study. The approach I used in this paper is both academic and personal. Similar to Park, I view language not from political and structural perspectives, but from subjective and personal engagement with the language as well. As a language student, I used to be seduced into celebrating our victories over English, partly because it is empowering to own English, and also because it allowed me to explain idiosyncratic use of and relationship with English. As an English teacher, however, I struggled trying to reconcile the world of English's paradigm that I subscribe to and the reality in the classroom, in which I have to point out grammar lapses to students or complain that the student's command of English is really bad. I was also part of the core team that conceptualized this project and developed the rubric. Patterning the rubric after IELTS seemed practical and efficient at that time, since this is the first time that we are developing an assessment tool. While we tried to accommodate some aspects of Philippine English during the calibration process, the concern of the team was more material rather than linguistic and symbolic. We were more concerned with arriving at consensus, concordance, and calibrating our grading system without thinking that, in a way, we are complicit in the idealization of a standard English. From patterning the rubric after IELTS to assigning qualitative values for each rating band and eventually marginalizing Philippine English. Thus, this paper offers a timely interrogation not only on Philippine English, but also on language conventions and academic practices. With all the changes and assessments that we are facing right now, from curricular changes, to obedizing our core syllabi, to migration to remote learning, which is mostly digital, I find it necessary to look into my own practice and ask myself the following questions, which could also be the same questions that we could ponder on as an institution. Okay. How prepared and amenable am I to these changes? Since language is dynamic, the shift to remote learning and probably the post-COVID-19 reality will bring changes in language and assessment. new terms, new meanings, new forms of assessment, and even a multimodal system of communication might be in place. And if this is going to be a long-term endeavor, do I need to rethink my notion of the standard? Is there a way for me as a language teacher to question the standards set by inner circle varieties of Englishes? How do we move from the theoretical aspects, such as nativization and the celebration of owning English and claiming that Philippine English is a legitimate variety, to the actual practice, which is decolonizing English teaching, accepting Philippine English features in grammar and vocabulary, and even accommodating rhetoric that is distinct to Filipinos? These are the questions that I reflect on and hope to address eventually in the course of my teaching and research practices. These are also the questions that we could eventually ponder on as an institution. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Saqueton. We will now move on to introducing her reader for this afternoon. So Dr. Roani Tupas has graciously agreed to be her reader for this afternoon. So Dr. Tupas currently lectures in social linguistics in education at the Center for Applied Linguistics, Institute of Education at the University College of London. Prior to his current appointment, he taught at the University of the Philippines in Diliman at our department, Virginia Tech in the United States, National University of Singapore, and the National Institute of Education at the Nanyang Technological University, also in Singapore. He is an associate editor of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language and on the international advisory and editorial boards of several journals, including TESOL Quarterly and Language Teaching. So, Dr. Tupas, you have the floor.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. I'm speechless seeing all your names on the screen. I see so many familiar names, and I just first would like to say hello to everyone. It's so nice and so great to be around. I see new names as well, so I hope to be able to be in touch with you. You know, in at some time in the future. Well, I don't have a written paper to respond, but I do have, of course, a list of things to say about the paper of Grace. Thanks very much, Grace, for a comprehensive presentation. I am excited first on a personal level because when she started with this is how I started with this my MA thesis, and then from there I move on to go back to my MA thesis and critique it. It's also exactly the same thing that that happened to me when I did my master's thesis in UP, and I went back to it and somehow developed further my own research program. So to start my reading and as well as my reflection on the work of Grace, I think the best thing for me to do perhaps is to locate it within the area of work that I operate in, because that's exactly where the paper, I believe, is placed in or is positioned. It works nicely within the social linguistics in education, which is which is a field that attempts to bring together two seemingly incommensurable fields, one social linguistics and the other is education. One which attempts to describe and surface, how people use language and evaluate it in terms of trying to understand why they do use language. But at the same time, you have education where subtle and even explicit forms of prescriptivism appear. So social linguistics and education coming together is always a conflicted affair. And I think that, to me, personally, is why it is a very fascinating area to work in, because things don't get resolved. Conversations continue all along. And that is why I think I'd like to take on from what Grace's paper generates, which is a continuing conversation in the area of the politics of global English research. Because while she does start, she works it out within the context of World Englishes. World Englishes is part of a constellation of areas of research that basically deal with the politics of global English. And here, when we talk about the politics of global English, it's of course the politics of how global English spreads and pluralizes and localizes. The idea being that when one talks about global English, one also talks about local English, and more specifically local Englishes. There's no such thing as basically global, because the more, when one starts or begins to talk about global English, you already start talking about local English. But when people start talking about the politics of localization or pluralization, that's when the different paradigms come into the picture. So World Englishes is one of that. English is an international language, as well as another. English is a lingua franca, which is a more recent paradigm to explain the spread of English, is another one. And I would also include translingualism as part of this whole paradigm of investigating the pluralities of English. Now, this, of course, this question has always been, the question of pluralization and the impact on local communities has always been around for so many decades, even in the early. Okay, I don't want to put my age somewhere, but even in the early 80s, in the late 80s, we were already starting to talk about it here in the context of post-colonial theory, of course, which is the very in thing in the department at the time in UP. So if you really come to think of it, the questions about pluralization and about Philippine English are not really new. So it actually begs the question, why are we still talking about it? But of course, the point is that English continues to be pluralizing or pluralized. And at the same time, in the context, for example, of education, it is still a highly, highly contested phenomenon. So while sociolinguistically, it is supposed to be an assumption that English pluralizes and localizes, the way, its effects on learners, its effects on teachers and on the educational system in general, continue to be a source of contradiction, conflict, and conversation. And that is where I think why I find the work of Grace as a continuing conversation in this particular area, especially because she talks about rubrics and assessment rubrics. Very little work has been done so far in this particular area. A lot of pluralization issues are done, ironically, in Western contexts, such as the United States, where they talk about the impact of World Englishes, or basically plurilingualism, on the writings of students, but very little still outside these contexts. So I think there is a place there for this particular paper. So I would like to start therefore by saying that I'm happy that Grace somehow frames her work on pluralization as theoretically sound and theoretically appropriate. Because indeed, if you look at it through the lens of education or through the lens of what we do in the classroom, all of the social linguistic descriptions and evaluations of pluralization somehow then start to dismantle by themselves, because they just don't work. So the question is, why don't they work? Or if they work to some extent, why is it that it still gets contested? And so the framing of the paper, to me, is, at least in the context of social linguistics and education, in the context of World Englishes, is theoretically sound. And I'm happy to start off my discussion of the paper on that end, because if something doesn't sound right theoretically, I believe, it's very difficult to talk about methodology. It's very difficult to talk about analysis, and so on and so forth. So I guess my point here initially is that the paper by itself is positioned very strategically within an area of research that is very much talked about in conversation among scholars, precisely because after 30 or 40 decades of talking about Philippine English, 30 or 40 decades of talking about world Englishes, why are we still talking about exactly the same thing? I think this is the main question. So why are we exactly talking about the same thing? It's precisely because perhaps we are talking about exactly the same thing. So we should be talking about other things as well in order to make sense of conversations that keep on coming back. I also like the fact that Grace talks of frames the rubric as something just simply beyond an assessment artifact. It continues to circulate, I think, in the educational contexts. Why in educational contexts that rubrics are basically talked about and reflected on as assessment tools, and how rubrics validate or invalidate certain learners and so on and so forth, and whether or not they actually make sense empirically speaking. Not that this is intrinsically wrong, but if people stop talking about something beyond this, I think there's something missing. We are missing something. And talking about the rubric as a politicized artifact, that it is, according to Grace, a repository of ideologies, I think is another step forward, at least in the context of social linguistics in education, because that is then how you can link back to the question of unequal Englishes, to be able to have a much more theoretically robust definition and construct of what assessment rubrics are. Lastly, also, I think I like the paper in the sense that it locates unequal Englishes in the context of an educational situation, an educational setting, where global English is perpetuated, of course, but at the same time, still hugely contested. I think I started by saying that in the context of social linguistics in education, talking about global English, talking about standards are almost always still contested. But here I see the promise of the paper in terms of how, in terms of the effects of unequal Englishes on, let's say, learners, on teachers, because although this, I think, was not really the scope of the paper, this can actually be pushed forward and in the future as part of a research program where one actually undertakes to look at the impact, the effects of unequal Englishes on learners and their learning achievements, for example. Because so much has been done on how dialects, for example, whether one recognizes this in the classroom or not, the fact that these attitudes are there either positively or negatively impact learning. And so one wonders, and one tries to also find out. I mean, it's happening in different other parts of the, other contexts as well, but I guess in the context of assessment writing, assessment rubrics, as in reference to what Grace said, it would be good to see how it actually impacts learning as well, and teaching for that matter. A few things, I mean, so moving forward, I think this is how I would like the paper to proceed as well, because I see a lot of promise. There's so much promise here. I think by itself, the paper with a little bit of tweaking is publishable, all right? I'm of course really looking at it now from the point of view of as editor of an international journal, and see how, okay, all right, so dito pwedeng ipasok, pwede dito ipasok, pwedeng ipasok dito, all right? But rhetorically, structurally, in terms of organization, the paper by itself is already well done, right? So I think there's needs to be some kind of elaboration along the way that needs to be done in order for it to be, I think, firmer theoretically and even methodologically. So these are some of my thoughts in this area. Number one is, of course, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the rubric was produced as part of a mandate, if I'm not mistaken, a task to investigate or to look at, to examine, the writing skills, right, or the proficiency level of academic writing students in UP or in your courses, as well as the writing skills. I think I'm using these words in relation to the task that was given to the committee in producing the rubric. I mentioned this because I think Grace chooses the language part, as the main focus of the discussion. I thought that this could have actually been expanded to discuss the entire rubric itself. And because the rubric itself is based on a certain construct that may not necessarily have been surfaced. And these constructs, of course, again, I borrow from what was mandated on the, what was asked of the committee to do, is to look at the proficiency level in academic writing and the writing skills of students. So the question here, therefore, is this rubric based on the construct of what writing skills are, based on the construct of what proficiency in academic writing is, all right? Because by just simply looking at the language part, one's not able to see the rubric in its entirety. And this is then, therefore, how you might be able then to relate, to locate unequal Englishes, not only in the context of the language component, but in relation to, the rest of the components as well. So I put down here, for example, how particular forms of English, which are in the language part, are actually made to link with particular kinds of content in writing, right? So that's when unequal Englishes then becomes much more robust, not just in the context of language, but how it actually it overlaps with, or has an interplay with other types of or categories in the rubric. When you talk about proficiency in academic writing as well and writing skills, one therefore can then look at the very fact that it categorizes these skills, or at least this proficiency, according to three main parts, which is, of course, the traditional way of looking at it: content, organization, and language, right? So how does that, what does it mean in relation to how it surfaces the very construct of proficiency, where you actually separate one from the other in order to investigate it? And that's exactly what I think partly in Unequal Englishes attempts to dismantle, which is to move away simply from categorizing or essentializing parts of an essay or an argumentative writing, but to look at them in holistically and see how alternative ways of means of assessment can come into the picture. Another thing also, I think that you mentioned, I think I love the fact that I think you did mention about inequalities between Englishes, all right? But I think fundamental to unequal Englishes is its rootedness in relations of power among people, among speakers, all right? I think moving forward, you might want to really look at just simply beyond inequalities of Englishes, but inequalities of speakers of these Englishes, right? Or users of these Englishes. And I think that's what I think you need to look into, because I think power doesn't really reside in languages and dialects and varieties itself, right? Certain languages and varieties are invested with power precisely because of the speakers who use them, right? So if you take the speakers away, the teachers away, the learners away from these varieties, then we are missing a big part of that whole idea of inequalities of Englishes. And because of that, I think I think how the rubric becomes and how the rubric is constructed theoretically and conceptually may probably even need to be expanded in order to account for what I just said. I love also the fact that you did mention about the rubric as a repository of ideologies. But then again, when you talk about the rubric as a repository of ideologies, it's basically, it still goes back to the idea of the rubric as something that's passive, it's something that's there, that contains all these ideologies. But if you look at the rubric in relation, for example, to power relations and inequalities of languages and speakers, then you can actually probably look at the rubric not only as repositories of ideologies, but as an institutional mechanism that organizes how we not just think, but an institutional or mechanism that organizes how we work, how we deal with our students, how our teachers teach, in a sense. So the rubric by itself is something that actively moves people around in institutions, that mobilizes people around in institutions. So when we think of the rubric as that, then we can look at, in terms of its production, how is it produced? And I think you did mention that, but I think that was not the focus of your paper. And how it circulates within an institution, how it gets circulated and why, for example, and its consumption as well. How is it consumed? Because it's one thing to be able to say that this is what the rubric does, should do, but at the same time, when you are actually looking at how it is being consumed by teachers, for example, how it is being contested on the ground, and what is its impact, for example, on learning achievements of students, and how it hierarchizes students. I think this is where the fascinating part to me comes into the picture. So I guess just to put things in perspective, I personally, of course, the tenured faculty will have their own say, but I personally would like to congratulate you for a very good paper, a well-written paper, and I'm very happy that it's pushes the boundaries of Philippine English, all right, at the very least. And the fact that it's located within the questions of a writing rubric, I think there is a place there, and there is a niche there for you in terms of your research, right? On the other hand, I think I need you to push it even further by looking at the rubrics, not just simply as an artifact, not just simply as something that contains, certain ideologies, but something that by itself moves people and mobilizes people. Because in that case, that's where you can actually dig deep into inequalities between learners, for example, who gets privileged or not, and unpack who they are and their identities in the classroom as well. Okay, all right. So from me, congratulations. So thank you very much.